purpose of this webinar is to discuss whether giving parents the power to choose where their children attend school is a right or a privilege. On this day, the second day of Black History Month, a month when America reflects on the contributions and experiences of Black Americans to American history and to our country's quest to ensure it lives up to its promises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all, we meet to ask the question, is parent choice a civil right? Is access to quality education worthy of the energy, vigor, attention, and debate of other rights we advocate for every day? Let's get started. I'm going to ask everybody on my panel to introduce themselves. And as we're doing that, we're going to put up a poll. We want to know who is listening in. We're going to give you an option to choose. Are you a parent, an educator, a funder, a journalist, an advocate, or a policymaker? Some of you fall in many different categories, as I do, but choose the one you most identify with. This will give those in the audience an understanding of who's listening, but also give our panel at least some guidance in really how to direct their questions. So we're going to start with you, Lakisha Young, out on the West Coast. Please introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from and who you represent.
Hi, my name is Lakisha Young. I am the co-founder and CEO of the Oakland REACH. And I just said it, I represent Black and brown families attending Oakland Public Schools, Oakland, California. I'm a mom of three. So I don't want to forget that. I've got a daughter that's about to head to college. And then I have a high school freshman and then a middle schooler.
Great. Take it all the way down south to Florida. Brother T. Willard Fair.
I'm T. Willard Fair, president of the Urban League of Greater Miami, an 82-year-old colored man that's just concerned about educating children.
Thank you, sir. Right here in the DC metro area, Brother George Parker.
My name is George Parker. I'm I'm just an advocate for quality education for people of color, for all people, but specifically people of color. I am a 30-year mathematics teacher in middle school and high school in the District of Columbia. Also was president of the DC Teachers Union during probably one of its greatest period of transition and chaos at the same time, but I thought we made some accomplishments. Currently now I'm a consultant with the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools to advise on school support.
And last but not least, Brother Shavar Jeffries.
Shavar Jeffries from the great city of Newark, New Jersey. I'm a civil rights attorney by trade. I've litigated all types of education cases, racial profiling, economic justice for Black and brown communities. I'm now president of Education Reform Now and Democrats for Education Reform. We're a national advocacy organization that advocates for educational equity and educational justice for low-income students and students of color as well.
Thank you. Let's get the poll results up. Let's see who we have with us today. Great. We have about 40% of those on this Zoom that are advocates for public education, and that's how they most identify. We also have parents and educators as well. So I just wanted to give you all a taste of where we are and what we're going to do today. So let's get started. In 1973, in a case called San Antonio District versus Rodriguez, it established that education is not a right guaranteed by the US Constitution. But last year, former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Alan Page called for a constitutional amendment to give every child in Minnesota an equal right to a quality education. The proposal came on the heels of new research by the Minneapolis Fed that showed that in Minnesota had some of the worst educational disparities in the nation. Shavar, I want to come to you first. In states where there is a constitutional right giving parents and students the right to a quality education, do parents have legal standing to choose where their children go to school if they can prove they're not getting that right? And if a parent came to you with this case in a state where the right to an education was guaranteed, would you represent her or him? And what would be your strategy as an attorney?
Yeah, so great question. Just so everyone is aware, as Curtis laid out, while there isn't a federal constitutional right to an education, many state constitutions, in fact, a majority of state constitutions in the country grant some qualitative right to an effective education to students. States are all over the map in terms of what that quality benchmark looks like. Some states have said that's a minimal education. Some have even said it's basically a basic 8th grade education to enable basic competencies in terms of reading and writing. Some, like the great state of New Jersey, where I'm from, have a more ambitious vision, which talks about the type of education that will enable students to be competitive in the economic labor markets and also to practice the responsibilities of citizenship. Most courts that have interpreted these principles in the context of litigation have required a variety of remedies within the traditional confines of public education, which has basically meant traditional public schools delivered within the boundaries of what the school district is. And of course, we know that the boundaries of the school district are connected to redlining and historical practices to lock in poor people, particularly poor people of color, in urban communities and have suburbs and exurbs that are more wealthy and tend to be disproportionately white. So once you connect your remedy to the district line, by definition, you're perpetuating the practices of racial segregation. And so we've seen remedies that have required more funding, and we absolutely know we need more funding in many of our schools, particularly our urban schools. We know for too long they've been disinvested in, so that's a good thing. We've seen some other courts that have required a variety of adequacy measures in terms of the type of curricula that are used, the type of ways in which districts go about hiring and preparing teachers. But what we haven't seen are remedies that enable parents to leave a school that isn't working based upon objective benchmarks of proficiency and graduation rates and go to another. So that's where they've drawn the line. Part of the reason they've drawn that line is because part of that would mean piercing the district boundary. And in as much as folks may say they want to be progressive and be about racial justice, they want racial justice, but they want to keep Black and brown folk elsewhere. Once you start talking about, can you choose a school in my community? We don't want that. So we don't want that justice. So that's been part of the reason that basically the remedy stops at the district line. And then furthermore, for other reasons, even those of us who said, look, if y'all gonna put a gate around the district, some of us want to go and create some alternative public schools within these communities that you're locking us into. They've also said, generally speaking, you can't extend to that. So you have to be stuck within a traditional system where some of the schools have worked well, some have not. And so that's basically where courts have been. I absolutely would represent a client of the type you described, Curtis, to frankly push against the assumptions of the ways in which these remedies have been drawn to either enable low-income students to get into some of these suburban higher performing schools, or to the degree we have schools that aren't within a traditional public school, whether they're public charter schools in particular, to let them have access to those schools, or frankly, any school that's working. I'm very much in a by any means necessary. I'm a parent as well, parent of 2. I need my babies educated. I would love it if it happened in traditional public school. That's all good. And we have, matter of fact, my 2 children right now are in the traditional public school. If it has to be a public charter school, that's what it has to be. But whatever it has to be for the young people to learn, the parent ought to have the right to put their child in that environment that's going to enable them to fulfill their potential.
No, thank you very much. People, that I want to come to you. Quality education are the operative term. This term, quality. The Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 required all states to create a set of indicators, a report card of sorts, to measure school quality. But long before ESSA, Florida, your state, created the A+ plan, which rated schools based on 4th grade test scores. Schools were given letter grades, and students at D or F schools were given greater choice in school options. At the time, nearly half of 4th graders in Florida were reading severely below grade level. You're also a school founder as well. In 2016, Governor Scott of Florida signed HB 7029, creating an open enrollment option. And by open enrollment, we mean allowing parents, families to transfer from their assigned public school district to another. The new school must have room, parents must provide transportation, and the student must not under an expulsion or suspension order. The basis for the bill was to give parents more options to pick the best school for their children. So people, I want to come to you, and this question is, how is life different for parents of students in failing schools in Florida now than it was in 1999 or 2016 before these were put in place in the state of Florida?
Life is still the same. You just outlined how the governor and others have made the administrative and legislative mandates to be something new. but life is still the same. You still see most of the schools where the children who attend are colored are still there. The attitude in the state, however, has changed. We just came out of an election where a Black person was running against another person. It appeared that the Black person was going to win. But those who make the policy wanted the other person to win. And they pointed out that the Black person was anti-choice. Therefore, they were able to marshal 200,000 Black people to vote against the Black person because the Black person was not promoting what they wanted. So it's about attitude of the masses. Until there is an outcry on behalf of those who have the children in these schools to demand, not simply ask, but to demand, and then if they do not get a response to their demands, act accordingly, then we'll keep having these conversations about how important it is for us to have choice. But until education has value, then choice is really insignificant.
How important was it in Florida and around the country through ESSA for us to give parents sort of this report card, to even, to give them a sense of how well their school is doing so that they can demand better? I think these report cards, this measure of quality in many ways is the ticket that parents are looking for to be able to go to their government officials to demand better. So can you talk a little bit about that, T. Willard, in far as—
That's not the attitude. I got 13 schools in my educational village. All of those schools are underperforming schools. They have underperformed ever since I was chairman of the State Board of Education. They will continue to underperform until the attitude of the parents to whom the children belong to value education. There is no significant value placed on education by the parents to whom the children belong to. So choice is just choice for those who understand the value of choice. But the majority of people in my district send their children to school because the law says that they must go there, and they have completed and are in compliance with the law. So until we restore value to education, until the parents believe that no matter what the circumstances are, if I educate my child, their life can be better. That attitude does not exist in Liberty City. We send them there because the law says we must send them there. And if we don't send them there, then we may not get our welfare check.
Let's get a parent perspective on this. Lakisha, I want to come to you. And you made a lot of news recently, Lakisha. Oakland and Los Angeles parents and students filed a lawsuit accusing California and its top education leaders of violating the state constitution by denying traditionally underserved students equal access to education opportunities during this COVID pandemic. The Oakland REACH, which you are CEO and co-founder, along with Community Coalition, was party to this lawsuit. How are you and other leaders, other families, other organizations able to organize parents and students around this lawsuit? And what can other organizations around the country learn from you all in California?
Well, first I need to pick my mouth up off the floor for a second. Okay, so just give me a 5 second on that. What I just heard. I do have to start off by saying parents do care about their kids' education. They care about their kids' education, especially Black and brown families, because when you think about how much they overcome, given that some of us have the privilege, right, of sending our kids to school, but knowing we can pay the mortgage and the rent, and we got the income coming in with no problems, right? But for a parent to really be fighting for their kids' education, but they still trying to figure out how to pay the light bill and put groceries in the refrigerator, that's a gangster. You feel what I'm saying? So when you ask the question about how did we kind of do this or organize parents, it's really about how could we not, right? Our parents are fed up. They are fed up. They're fed up with a system that continues to fail their families generation after generation. Grandmama went to the school, mama went to the school. Folks have left those schools barely able to sort of build a strong, family tree. And so somebody says enough is enough. This baby is going to college, and I'm gonna do whatever I need to do. And I think what's important to share with some of the panelists is you can't, when you know better, oftentimes you can do better. So many folks just don't know what they can do to fight this system, right? And that's why I think it is important to have parent advocacy groups like the Oakland REACH, right? Because we then have the opportunity to really educate families about how this system has failed them. And many of them have gone through the schools, but they're like, oh, this is why this strike happened. This is how it looks on this end, right? But a lot of parents don't know. They're kind of running like guinea pigs, but they don't have a sense of like why we're not getting ahead. So again, the reason why we jumped on this lawsuit is because our parents are tired of talking about problems, right? We know our problems. It's all about solutions. So the reason why we jumped on this lawsuit is because this was not a do something lawsuit. This was a do this lawsuit. We had stepped into the gap of what was not being taken care of by the state or our local district in terms of educating our babies. And we kind of pulled that Black Panther mentality up, built our own, educated our own, saw results with our own. So, and then we were like, wait a minute, we shouldn't have to do this. We shouldn't have to pull all these resources together. And what's happening in every other city in California and across this country that doesn't have a virtual hub, right? Providing literacy and all of these pieces. So for us, and I've shared this before with you, Curtis, it's like, we got to run parallel tracks. We build and we sue, right? So we're going to build our own, we're going to build our solutions, but we also going to sue the system that puts in a position where we have to do this work and educate our own children.
And I'm glad you said that. I mean, again, it's not either or. It's sort of, in the Black church, we say pray while moving your feet, right? You actually, you demand more, but you also act as well. So here's our next survey question, and we're gonna throw this on the screen. And this is a question around this idea of adequate versus quality, and you gotta be able to choose one. Every state constitution should include a quality or adequate education. Which one do you believe every state constitution should guarantee? Is it a quality education, or is it simply an adequate education? And we're gonna, allow you all to take that survey. And while you're doing that, I'm gonna throw it over to good brother George Parker. In 2008, parents and students in Rhode Island brought a class action suit claiming they didn't have access to civics education. The judge dismissed the case and rejected that equal protection claim, but agreed that although the United States Supreme Court left the door open just a crack for reconsideration of this 1973 decision that I mentioned earlier around there not being a guarantee in the US Constitution for education, he interpreted that crack to allow the courts to consider a case in the future that alleges that students are receiving education that is totally inadequate. So he used this term totally inadequate as a sort of a means to say, if you can prove this, then this is worth reconsideration. So George, totally inadequate are sort of these two terms I want to talk about. How would you define inadequate? Sorry. And it's, so let me kind of give you some cues. Is having an unqualified teacher for 1, 2, 3 years in a row deemed totally inadequate? What about being in a failing school based on these ESSA ratings? Is that considered totally inadequate? And if so, should the parents who are in schools that if we agree on what this means, should those parents have greater options if their school is deemed totally inadequate?
Wow, you had a lot of questions there. Let me start out by first talking about the inadequate versus the totally inadequate. I know that earlier Shavar was speaking of some of the states that have civil rights clauses regarding education, that adequate could be interpreted as an 8th grade education. Today, an 8th grade education, if adequate means 8th grade education, it is far subpar to what is needed in today's world. In fact, kids who graduate with a 12th grade education still need more in this new education technology and et cetera. But in terms of defining totally inadequate, I don't think we can do it until we first can define adequate. because what do we have to compare it to? I think a lot of the discussion, even for those who may remember No Child Left Behind, a lot of the problems in implementing No Child Left Behind is that it was implemented based on failing schools as opposed to successful schools. So we pretty much use test scores to decide whether or not a school was successful. But what we never did was had a general consensus of what does a quality and successful school look like. Well, one of the difficulties, and I heard you, Lakisha, when you talked about parents have to be, a lot of them don't know. Well, one of the things we've never clearly defined for parents, especially in underserved communities, is what does a quality, high quality school look like? What are the ingredients? How do you know whether or not your school is of high quality? So I think until we can define what a high quality school is, and I'm using the word quality because I just think the word inadequate, first of all, the use of the word adequate sets a low bar, period. You know, I look at it as in terms of a doctor. I don't want a doctor that is adequate. I don't want adequate care in the hospital. I want high quality, superb care. And that's what our students deserve. So I think, but back to your question, how would I define it? It would be that I don't think I could really define it except using a rubric that tells us here's what quality education is, here's what highly adequate education is, and measure it against that. In terms of the unqualified teacher, and I want to just make a brief distinction between an unqualified teacher and an uncertified teacher, right? Because on the No Child Left Behind, there was a lot of emphasis about uncertified teachers. Unqualified teachers, period, shouldn't be teaching anybody, because that means you don't have the ability, or you wouldn't want an unqualified physician, right? So, but that's different though than schools having uncertified teachers, because there are a lot of persons who bring real live experience to the classroom who may not have a teacher's license, but their real life experience, they got a lot to share with kids about the real world to show them how to survive and succeed, accounting and other kind of things, right? So I think unqualified, that definitely a kid should never have 3 unqualified teachers in a row. But uncertified is questionable because you can bring a knowledge base. So some uncertified instruction could be acceptable because it's the knowledge that's important and your ability to implement that knowledge to kids. There was one other thing that you asked, failing schools. Yeah, I mean, if we ever could define a failing school with a rubric that is really one that is comprehensive for children. Should parents have options if a school is failing? I believe I would even want to go farther to say parents should have options even if a school is not failing. Because I taught 30 years in a public school system, right? Traditional public school system. And one of the difficulties with the traditional public school system is like trying to turn around the Titanic, right? It's so large until you got to turn, you take more room and more time to turn it around. Whereas if you have a variety of schools and opportunities for students, you can turn it around like a boat. And that's one of the problems the traditional public school system has, is that it is a system. And with any large system, there's bureaucracy. And one of the most difficult things I even found as a union president when we were trying to get things moving in DC is working through the bureaucracy is probably more frustrating than the fact that schools are failing. So having a clear-cut path and schools that address the needs of students. Right now, my belief is that our school system, we take our students and adjust them and adapt them to our traditional public school system, as opposed to taking schools and adapt the schools to the needs of the students.
Thank you. Let's talk 2021, where under a pandemic, a large number of our school districts are either virtual or hybrid. And also, we just had an election where the United States elected a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate and controlled House. A lot of that support and vigor for the election came from the support of organizations like the teachers unions, of which, as you mentioned earlier, George, you are a leader of a local affiliate. And so let's talk about this idea of the Democratic Party and this issue of education and civil rights. So making the case for education as a civil right is not a new concept. In 2008, leaders from the Democratic Party, like Al Sharpton, Roger Wilkins, Joel Klein, and Cory Booker, met at the Democratic Convention to announce the Education Equality Project. The project challenged politicians, public officials, union leaders, and others to view fixing public schools as the foremost civil rights issue of the 21st century. We're 13 years later. Shavar, does the Democratic Party leaders see access to quality public education as a right for all or a privilege reserved only for some?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I wanted to say quickly too, because I gotta stand up for Black parents. You know, Black people from the time of the slave codes, when it was illegal for Black people to try to access education, to the present day. You look at most research, it actually shows that Black parents are more engaged, more involved in their kids' education than other communities. And just as myself, as a former school board member, I can't count the number of meetings that I went through where hundreds of Black parents were cussing me out every month about what wasn't happening in the school. How many churches you would go to, parents lined up through the pews to cuss me out about what wasn't happening in the school. So I just had to speak to that. Are there some that got to do more? Absolutely. But by and large, our Black parents are doing everything they can to make sure that their child has more opportunities than they did. So I just want to say that. In terms of the Democratic Party, no question. I mean, the Democratic Party is very strong in terms of educational equity. I'm going to talk in a second about some issues where we got to push the party. But particularly on funding, I mean, the Democratic Party has led in terms of greater investments in public education throughout this country. Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? He was, behind Title I. The great expansions we've seen in public funding over the last 30, 40, 50 years. We've seen Democrats at the forefront of that. Even in a lot of our cities where we've had significant reform activity, it's Democrat mayors, Democrat school board members, Democrat state legislators who are driving that. Even now with President Biden wants to triple Title I, which would be historic. He wants to make college debt-free for families that make less than $125,000. That would be historic. He wants to fully fund the IDEA. That would be powerful in terms of what we have to do for our young people. And so Democrats have really been strong and have been leading on the funding issue. Now and I'm a very strong Democrat, and very proud Democrat. Where I have to push some of my colleagues in the party is after we write the check, what else do we have to do, right? So one, we have to have a focus on equity, even free college, debt-free college we hear about. That's great, but that's part of the conversation. What about the legacy preference? I'm a very proud graduate of Duke University. I love Duke University. Duke didn't allow Black folks to attend Duke University until 1963. Who's going to benefit from the legacy preference? Early decision. You got to agree to go to the school before you know what the financial aid package is. If you're a family living check to check, you can't agree to go to school till you know what that financial aid package is. What about we have colleges where the completion rates are below 20%? We have to have accountability there. And so in addition to writing the check, we got to oftentimes push Democrats on equity and on accountability, and absolutely on K-12. So after the check is written, after we provide the support to the system, now you got to perform for the child. You got to perform for the student. The results have to be there. And we understand that educators have a very difficult job. We love our educators. I believe they're the most important professionals in this country. They have a very hard job, but we need people to do hard things. And so we have to hold the system accountable, providing the type of educational opportunities our students deserve. And we have to make sure we have a focus on equity. There's conversations now by Democrats on Capitol Hill about increasing teacher pay. Totally support that. But what we also support is saying we got to get our highest performing teachers and even pay teachers more who teach in the most high poverty schools, right? So we can't just have a one size fits all approach. We got to allocate our resources in those ways that will bring the greater return for our students. But then ultimately we have to demand the return. I mean, we started, Curtis, talking about the legal mandate, whether it's adequacy or higher quality. At the end of the day, the legal principle is illusory. It's a fantasy if there's not actually accountability to make sure it's being delivered in the lives of students each and every day.
Thank you. And before we come to you, George, I want to touch on Shavar's point about adequate versus quality, because we have results of our poll, and 98% of those who voted said every state constitution should include a guarantee of quality education. That should be the promise, and then it should be up to us to go back and demand that that promise is met. And so, George, I want to come to you. Do teachers unions see access to quality public education as a right or a privilege?
I think overall, and let me say this, I don't speak on behalf of the AFT or the NEA, though I'm a union member. I'm a former union president, so I want to make it clear I'm not speaking for Random Weingarten or for Becky, NEA. I think that unions, I believe unions are serious in terms of wanting to see kids educated. But I think unions to some degree have conflicting views. For example, and I heard Shavar talk about the Democratic Party has to be pushed on some issues. I think one of the other things the Democratic Party has to push unions on is more accountability. As a union president, and I'd be very honest, right? Up until I had this, as Oprah called, an aha moment about quality education for kids, I didn't have a teacher that was a bad teacher. And that's ridiculous because we got bad folks in every profession. But I'm just saying that Democratic Party has to push unions more on accountability and quality instruction. So that's one of the things that I think is going to be important. But I do believe that unions from a philosophical standpoint would support quality education as a civil right. But again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the decision makers, but I think I'd be very surprised if unions wouldn't get behind any type of legal action that would guarantee kids' right to a quality education. There are some issues regarding how unions view other schools outside of traditional public schools. And this is where I think Democratic Party has to push unions on to say this is not about whether a kid goes to a traditional public school, a charter school, or some other form of getting an education, that this is about education and quality education. And any system or any school that can provide a quality education to African-American kids and kids of color, it should be attended. It should be qualified.
And so, as a follow-up, and again, I asked you whether teachers unions see access to a quality education as a right or a privilege. What about the idea of access to a school that provides that quality education versus one that they may be attending that is not providing them that quality education? Do you think that they support access to a quality school for those students who are not receiving a quality education where they are?
Well, I can't speak into the hearts or from the hearts of what the union leaders feel at this point. What I can say is that from my experience, and even sometimes as union president myself, I definitely wanted kids to have access to a high quality school. The problem was I wanted kids to have access to high quality traditional public schools with the exclusively. And I think that's one of the problems we have in terms of why Democrats have to push unions, because there seems that there's this friction between traditional public schools and public charter schools. Both are public schools, but I think traditional public schools see charter schools as kind of stepping in on their exclusivity with teachers in the traditional public schools. So I think Democrats have to push that, but I do believe that union leaders definitely want to see kids in high quality schools, but they're going to have to be pushed on understanding high quality schools can't be limited to just traditional public schools who are not doing a very good job at this point educating Black and brown children.
Thank you. We have one last poll question, and this is the idea of right versus privilege of a quality education. And so this is the last question for those in the audience. And the question is, should choosing where their child attends school be a right or a privilege of every parent? Choose one. Is it a right to send your child to a school in your district or outside of your district, or is it a privilege for some? Because we also know that there are those who are already doing that right now. And so here's, as we're moving again forward to what this looks like actually in practice, not just theory, and those who are listening and saying, Curtis, that all sounds great. Every child should have a quality education, but there are just not enough options. And so in theory, making school choice a right rather than a privilege sounds fair, but in practice, how can we ensure there are enough spaces at so-called quality schools for all the students who flee or whose parents decide they want to get their child out of a failing one? And so, T. Willard, what is your response to those who say, you know what, trying to give every kid in America access to a quality education is just not feasible?
It is feasible. We simply must have the will to make it happen. Dade County Public Schools is getting ready to write its next 5-year plan. What we're saying to them is that the 13 failing schools in Liberty City can be just as right as the quote unquote not failing schools in Coral Gables or by the sea. So it can be done simply because of the fact that it's not being done. The school system has to be quote unquote challenged to make it happen. And if they don't make it happen, then those who are already privileged will continue to be privileged.
Lakisha, again, sounds really, really, promising in theory. In practice, you're in California, you're in Oakland, you're on the ground. You're going to leave this meeting and hit the pavement and continue to do the work. What are the barriers to making every school a quality one?
Because people have an out. The people who are responsible for making sure our kids are better have an out. Their kids are not in the schools they teach in. They have picked the best for themselves. There's no personal skin in it, right? And so a huge issue with that on not just the out, it's also the fact that lower income Black and brown families have not been at the table. They have not been at the table to be able to define what they want and what they need for their students. And they haven't even, like what we're talking about right now, unions and this or that, our family's not thinking about that on a day-to-day basis. They're dropping their kids off and trying to figure out if their kid gonna be able to read. And that's why it's so important, again, and I gotta give shout out because I'm looking and I'm seeing like, our cousins, Memphis, Lyft, and I'm not sure who else is on there. I saw Sarah, but I put this out there because until you really, really start educating families about the way this system kind of circulates above them, right? There's no way that we're gonna get quality. And then when our parents understand, oh, here's the trick. As soon as our parents understand what quality is, then we realize we don't have access to it, right? So even in a system where you can choose, then everybody's clamoring to get into those few schools that they feel like are performing better, right? And so that's why I go back again to the fact that like when you're on the ground and you're really trying to change this systemic issue, you've got to run parallel tracks, right? So for us, it was like winning an opportunity ticket policy that would give our families preference, right? In higher performing schools. But guess what? We also launched a literacy campaign to make sure the school down the street was doing better than having 5 or 6% of kids reading on grade level, right? You got to pull every single lever you possibly can. And I hate to say this because I think we putting too much on Black folks, Black and brown folks. And I'm saying Black folks because it's Black History Month, but our organization represents African-American and Latino families. That's a big burden to put on parents. When you got privilege, you don't like something, you look at the data, you make a left turn, right? And then this system just falls on like every bit of revenue that our school district gets, they get it off the back of Black and brown families who they never bring to the table. If all of our families left our school district, it would collapse. We are what's holding it up, but our voices have been sort of dismissed. So, I think what's key for me to say, and I know you're going to have another question around this, Curtis, is that I want to say this to folks out there, especially thinking about parents, because I don't want to just come here talking about parent power, parent issues and whatever. We as parent leaders and movement builders, we have to build the solutions that we know work for our communities and force this system on the local and state level to adopt it. Right? We keep saying we're not going to wait on Superman, right? We keep saying no one's coming to save us. So what are we doing to save ourselves, right? And we'll talk more hopefully in the latter part of this about what we put into place. But so much of what's building our power in Oakland is the ability to build what we know our community needs and then hold our local and state systems accountable for replicating it. I can't just be banging on your door telling you to do better by me 50 years later after my grandmother already graduated from high school and couldn't read. I have to put something in front of you to tell you we can take care of our own and you better replicate it. So that is just like what's really key that I want to bring to this table from a parent perspective is that we know the problems and some of us have fancier language around those problems, but ultimately our parents know they've been screwed. They've been asking, how do we fix this? How do we make this better? So I'm not running in that hamster wheel all the time. So again, when we get to that part, Curtis, we'll talk more about what we've created and what we built that actually have seen our kids reading that we're not reading in remote learning. We're not here to play no games when it comes to our kids. We're not here to play no games. And we're not going to be waiting for a system that we claim has failed us for decades to then get their act together during a pandemic. We're looking for the system that was failing us before the pandemic to all of a sudden serve us better during the pandemic. No. That's when you really, really pick up community. That's when you really pick up muscle, and that's when you build your own. That's when you build your own, especially as parents, because guess who has access to the parents? Groups like the Oakland REACH, groups like the Memphis Lift, right? So that's what's key. And so I look forward to, before we close this out, talking exactly about what those solutions should look like.
We're going to get there, but I want to show the results of this final poll. And so the people have spoken. When we ask those in our audience whether choosing where your child should attend a school should be a right or a privilege, 93% said it should be a right. And so there's clearly energy behind this. There's clearly a demand for better. Obviously, parents are more educated and understanding about what they're getting from their local school and are saying, this is what I'm getting. This is what you told me I was promised, but there's a disconnect here. And so how do I make the two come together? And so as we sort of are moving towards the closing out, or just sort of our conversation about what's next, and I definitely appreciate your point, Lakisha, around how a lot of these conversations devolve into this, here are a list of instructions for Black parents to go out to do and fall on their shoulders. But we're seeing every day on social media, on television, people in the streets marching, Black Lives Matter, demanding equal rights, equal treatment under the law on a variety of issues. The question is, how do we get public education into those conversations? How do we get people who may not even have children in public schools, who may not directly be affected by this? Where are the allies in this conversation? And so I want to ask this question. This is going to come to everyone, and I want you all to speak freely. Some believe it's time for a movement to make quality education a right in every state through amendments to state constitution, and if need be, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The consequence of failure would be giving families of choice the right to other public schools, traditional public or charter schools for their children, as Florida and other states have tried to do. So do you all agree that it's time that we do this? And if so, what should leaders around the country listening in? 40% of those who are on this call are advocates. They're saying, George, Shavar, Lakisha, T. Willard, okay, you got me. I'm on board. What's next? Anyone can jump in.
Let's see.
Well, I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead. Oh, go ahead, Shavar.
No, I thought George was jumping in, but if you're about to jump in, Lakisha, I'm trying to be a gentleman.
Okay, I'll jump in a moment then. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lakisha.
No, mine's gonna be kind of long, so everybody else go ahead. Let the parents wrap it up.
I'll be quick. I'll simply
All right,
say
Shavar.
that-
All right, Shavar. Go ahead, man.
I'll say it's a good thing to have a legal right. Most states have some version of a legal right already. I think there should be a federal right. I know there's some litigation, Detroit and other places to try to reverse the San Antonio decision. My caution would be this. I don't know if we need another piece of paper articulating a right that in many places already exists. We need execution and implementation, right? And so it's not to say we don't do it, but I think if we should be intentional about how many resources we place in that basket versus how many resources we place in, at least, my argument is empower Black people, right? My argument is we know how to educate our young people in our community better than anyone else. And when we empower Black people, that holds everybody accountable, right? So if Black people have more choices to make, that's going to hold the public charter schools accountable. That's going to hold the traditional public schools accountable. Because to Lakisha's point, parents ain't thinking about traditional public school. They think about, you educating my child. And if you're doing that well, they'll all be there for you. If you're not doing that well, they're going to come for your neck. And so my view is we need to have more focus and intention on the execution side, creating a movement around that, around what empowering Black families look like. The litigation and the rights conversation can be a part of that. Most of this we can already do in most state constitutions. And ultimately, the real way things are changed sustainably, I would argue in this context, is going to be, we got to overtake the political process, right? The judicial process is a very long process. Even when you think you've won, you got to, and I'm a civil rights lawyer myself, you got to go back to court to enforce, because what's going to happen? Even if we get that win where the court says, yep, there's this right to education, right? All these schools throughout the country, they're going to keep doing the same thing they've been doing, which means lawyers have to keep going back to the court to say, these 50,000 districts aren't doing what you said. You'll be on that merry-go-round for decades and decades and decades and decades. We saw this post-Brown, right? Brown was decided in 1954. We thought that was going to be a breakthrough in terms of at least desegregating public education. That wasn't necessarily about quality. Some people thought it was, because some people felt it couldn't be quality unless white people were there too. That's a whole nother conversation, but that was really about desegregation. That didn't happen because America's public schools are more segregated now than they were at the time of Brown. So I would caution putting too many resources around, let's go file some more lawsuits, let's get another piece of paper that says we have a right, and spend more resources on the political organizing, the organizing of families and parents, so that we're letting mayors, governors, school board presidents know, if you don't empower us for more options, we're going to come get you out. And we're going to elect Lakisha Young, and parents and community-based leaders like Lakisha, they're going to be making a decision because they're more aligned with our values.
George,
I'm gonna jump. You gotta let me go after Shavar, because Shavar just opened up the door for the parents.
No, okay. Hey, don't get me in trouble.
Okay, I know. Okay, go ahead, George. Go ahead, George. I didn't know Shavar was gonna do that. I didn't know Shavar was gonna do that.
I think I agree with Shavar. I think that probably some type of federal legislation in terms of having quality education defined nationally can help set the tone, focus, because I think one of the difficulties we're going to have, and I think there is a legal process, and I agree with Shavar, it is long, but politically, we have to set a tone. I think that some type of national legislation that could help to focus us on quality and a right. And I agree that having the right doesn't necessarily mean it's enforced, but it can help psychologically maybe to get people to focus on this. But I think one of the bigger problems and challenges is going to be all of us having to look introspectively, because even within the educational community, there is a lot of divisiveness in terms of what we should do and where we're headed. And so it's one thing to have a right, but it's another thing to now define how do we assess what that right and implement that right, as Shavar is saying. So coming to a consensus among all of the groups, what does quality look like, right? What does a quality school look like? I think even as a Democratic Party, those of us who support Democrats, right? We got to do some internal searching to decide what do we mean by quality education? What do we mean by racial equity? We use words, but it doesn't mean we're all on the same page in interpreting what it means. So I think that having some national dialogue about it to help get us all on the same page of how do we measure this could be important.
Lakisha?
George, that sounded, and from a philosophical perspective, but we ain't got that kind of time. Okay. We ain't got that kind of time. Okay. So we don't, because I think we know. You know, every time we turn around, somebody's like, we need to step back. We need to define quality. I'm like,
Well, we can do it, as you said,
our
Lakeisha,
babies can read.
we can walk two lines at the same time. We're gonna have to do a lot at the same time. So
You can,
do
but
more.
you know what happens, and that's why I am gonna walk you through the whole idea of, like, you know, and trying to tie these pieces together. So one, we do need to walk two lines, but we end up not walking that second line. We talk a lot and we have a lot of dialogue, but nothing gets executed, right? And then I'm gonna piggyback off what Shavar is saying, is that, again, this lawsuit is for us to push the system to do the thing that we've already created, right? This lawsuit is not just some kind of like, oh, lawsuit, because people forget about lawsuits next week, right? It's really about how do we leverage this lawsuit to make sure that what we built in Oakland, and I want to talk about what we built in Oakland, because I do think that there are people on this webinar who are like, what are the solutions, right? So let me just quickly walk you through something. So, because this didn't just happen in Oakland, it had to happen across the country. COVID hits, right? Kids are out of school. Parents lost connection with teachers. Kids and parents have lost connections with teachers, right? They're not in class. They haven't heard or talked to their teacher. And oh, let me add another little piece to this. Parents don't have technology infrastructure in their homes, right? They may have an iPad. They may have a computer that they use ever so often, and they may not have good internet access. So we're about to go into a pandemic where we have kids and communities that have already been behind. They have no connection with the teacher. They waiting for the teachers union in the district to negotiate how many hours per day. So we've lost 3 weeks, okay? Nobody's got the parents' phone numbers, right? Because, you know, we don't really build relationships oftentimes like that with our communities. We're so busy focusing on, you know, oh, let's just like get the kid right. We don't oftentimes respect Black and brown families and how critical parents are being at the table. But it mattered now when a pandemic hit that you didn't have that phone number, right? But guess who had the phone numbers? We had the phone numbers, and we sat and we thought, do we want to try to turn our families in this pandemic back into a system that's been failing them for generations? Or are we going to listen to our families and build what we've been wanting this whole time? Do you know how little progress we make banging on doors? Do you know what little progress we've made, even in so much of the work that I believe the Oakland REACH has done? It has never been, to me, as impactful as what we've done during this pandemic. Why? Because we had the opportunity to build the solutions that our families needed. So what we built was what we call the virtual family hub, okay? That virtual family hub hired teachers. We hired 14 teachers over the summer, good teachers, quality teachers, to teach our babies how to read, okay? Every family had a family liaison. Our families need support. We provided cash assistance for families. Because again, if you got to figure out how to keep the light on and make sure your child's educated, that's too much. So let's help out with that a little bit so we can focus, right? We also provided our family stipends at the end of our first phase. At the end of the first phase of our hub, this is what I'm telling you about what parents can do. 60% of our K-2 students went up 2 or more reading levels on the district-wide reading assessment, and 30% went up 3 or more. We had kids who were not even sounding out words that were reading at the end of 5 weeks on remote learning. So please, I don't want to hear anybody telling us what can and can't happen, how underfunded we are, how much money we don't have. California used to be much better funded, and they were still failing Black and brown folks, right? Anything you want to do right, you can do right. But that's why it's important for us as parent leaders and parent movement builders to make sure we are building the solutions for our communities and forcing these systems to adopt it. This was an amazing opportunity for us to step over the systems that have been failing us and saying, if you're going to give us money and resources to do it, we're about to build our own. We've been running that hub. We have seen kids reading better. We have families feeling more supported and empowered. Parents created that. The system did not create that. But we don't have time to wait, you guys. We do not have time to wait. So I'm just kind of looking around on the panel and just saying, one, please don't ever say that parents don't care about their kids, because I ain't never seen parents like our parents care more about their kids and deal with some of the issues that they dealt with. I went to college. I'm first generation college grad, trying not to be the last. You know, I don't have like a legacy of folks graduating from college. So we got to work hard or we could go sideways at any moment. This stuff is hard, but there's a lot of folks try to have their first Lakishas, right? When you try to have that first kid go to college, that child's in the 5th grade and you hit a pandemic, what do you do? What do you do? You know, and you lost your job and you got a family member in your house with a pre-existing condition, and it goes on and on and on. So I just want to really put out there that what we are saying to California, what we are saying to Oakland is do this. We're not waiting on you. We're not asking for you to come up with the solutions. We didn't came up with it. Now we're holding you accountable for replicating it.
We're at time. T. Willard, I want to give you the final word. Brother, you've been doing this for a long time. You've been in the trenches. What's your final word on how we move forward?
County public school system is now in the process of getting ready to draft this next 5-year plan. And I think that it's our responsibility to make sure that that plan incorporates all the things that we've talked about here today. We have a golden opportunity to influence what's going to go into the plan. We plan to do that. We plan to make sure that as they define this 5-year plan for the 4th largest school district in the United States, that they take into consideration all the stuff that we've talked about here today. The process normally happens is that we have a great discussion and then we go back to church and they go and design the plan that perpetuates what they're doing. We don't plan to let that happen. We talked about the Democratic Party and what it is or is not doing. What's Jim Clyburn's position on all of this stuff that we're talking about? Because Jim probably is the most powerful people of color that we know in this whole process. I've got 2 school board members who supposedly represent all the things that we've talked about. We simply allow people to run and get elected because of our conditions and then behave like they don't know what our conditions are. So part of our discussion is to make sure that we look at the profile and the commitment of those who are going to be running for public office that will be in a position to talk about these policy needs that we have. And also make sure that if they don't do what they're supposed to do, we punish them. We have a way of just forgiving them because they're colored and we're colored. So I think the pandemic, as Lakisha pointed out, provided us with an awesome opportunity to be involved in going forward. We were the only agency in town that did not support going back to school. I refused to send children in Liberty City back to a place that was murdering their spirit before the pandemic. So we came up with fix it, not rearrange it. That at the end of the day, we got an obligation to take full advantage of this opportunity to do all the things that we spent the last hour talking about.
I believe Dr. King was right. It is up to us, to all of us, for every generation to hold our government accountable to its promise, to cash in that promissory note of a quality public education, wherever it may be. We agreed on that today. The question is, what do we do with that? I want to thank my panelists for joining me today, everyone who logged in, everyone watching on C-SPAN. Thank you so much for engaging with us on this conversation during this Black History Month as we discussed and as we chart a path to ensure that public education, that quality public education, that parent choice is a civil right. Thank you all so much. Now let's get back to work.
Bye, everybody.